Greetings, fellow conquerors, and welcome to a guide about proper unit stacking. This is Darkfire Slide, and today I'm going to talk about how to properly stack your armies here in EU4, general strategies, as well as, what the actual numbers are for those of you who are curious. Many of you asked for this guide, and I'm going to deliver. Most of the research done for this episode was taken from the wiki, my own personal experience, and Zwirbomb's unit guide from the Paradox forums, a forum document you can actually download at a PDF version from the forums that I will link in the description below. I highly recommend reading it because it will tell you a lot about understanding how unit pips work and how to better leverage them in your own experience, based on tech groups and individual unit strength. That being said, that's a discussion for another time, so let's get on to the discussion of proper unit stacking. First things first, we're going to look here, and currently, our combat width is 27. Now, what is combat width? In a word, it sounds simple. It's the number of troops that you can field at one time, How does this translate in game? Well, if we look at this battle we've got here going on with the Ottomans, we've got this huge mass of troops here, and I'll save you this time of actually counting it. Each row has 27 slots. That means that the front row and the back row both have 27 spots. In the front row, we only need about 27 troops to actually fill the lines. So, for example, we could have 23 infantry and 4 cavalry, and that would be pretty good. And for the military tech that we're at, that would actually be quite perfect because of the flanking range that cavalry actually have, which we'll discuss in a second. And in the back row, we don't have as much artillery as we could have. In fact, if we had 10 more artillery, this would be a perfectly stacked army for the most part. A little too much cavalry, though. We could trim down on that a little bit as well. But let's talk about, now that we know what combat width actually is, it's the number both in the front and the back. So if you double it, that's the number of troops that you can actually field. But let's talk about what these things actually mean. So, if we've got this many troops, it's important to note that cavalry and infantry can only do damage if they're in the front row. So when combat width is 15, for example, at the early stages of the game, I think the base is like... I'm actually not sure what the base is, if I'm being 100% honest. Let's see, plus, I think it's 15 or something like that. Might be 10. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is... sorry, very unprofessional of me to not have the exact number ready, isn't it? But the main point is, if we have 27 combat width like in this situation, only 27 of our troops can fight in the front row. Any troops that get deployed to the back row, like these infantry here, aren't actually helping. They're not doing anything because they can't attack from the back row. So the kind of ideal way to go about doing this, the proper stacking for the front rows, is you want to have about as much as the flanking range of your current tech will allow, plus a few extra infantry regiments. So, let's talk about that. So flanking range is going to relate more to cavalry since cavalry have a bigger flanking range. What's flanking range, you ask? Well, flanking range is the number of tiles away that a cavalry can attack in an equal stack. So, if we've got 27 combat width here, our current flanking range is currently only at 25%. And at this stage in the game, cavalry can only flank 2 tiles away, 2 units away. So the ideal stack, even at this range, for improved flanking range 1, which actually doesn't really do anything when you look at the numbers, you really only need about 4 cavalry per stack up until Tech 18. So Tech 0 through 17, you only need 4 cavalry to get the maximum amount of flanking from your cavalry. Apart from that, you can just basically have infantry, which are cheaper, going to fill the ranks, and in some cases do about as much damage as cavalry. Now, this differs if you are playing someone like Anatolia, maybe Eastern nations with good cavalry bonuses, or Muslim nations or Horde nations where you can actually field more cavalry, because then you'll actually want a good portion of your front line to be cavalry. But in Western nations and other nations that only get a 50% support modifier, or 50% before insufficient support, at this stage of the game you're only going to need 4. This upgrades at Tech 18, and at Tech 18 through 22, you want to have about 6 cavalry per stack that you have, per proper stack, because you can flank up to 3 tiles away, and that's the maximum efficiency that you can get out of cavalry. It then goes up one more time at Tech 23 to Tech 30, which is going to be 8 cavalry per stack, basically, to get the proper efficient, the most efficient way to do it, basically. So, that being said, that's generally, that's how much cavalry you should have. Take notes of it. Tech 0 through 17, you want about 4 cavalry. Tech 18 through 22, about 6 cavalry. Tech 23 to 30, 8 cavalry per stack. Now, as far as artillery goes, well, actually, let's talk about infantry for a second. So, we've got our cavalry. Pretty much, we want to have as many other infantry in that stack as we could afford to have, without, going crazy. So, if we have 27 in this current front row, so we have 27 infantry, that's a little too much. Except it's not, and let me explain why. So if we've got 4 cavalry, it would seem like the ideal amount would be 23 troops, because that would add up to 27. But here's the problem. Infantry take the brunt of the casualties when you're fighting a battle. So as a result, you typically want to have an extra 6 to 8 infantry regiments, to make up for the losses that you're going to take. So ideally, this army would have something like 4 cavalry. It has a little bit more than that because I stacked 2 separate stacks to do this. It would ideally have 4 cavalry, so 2 on each side, and then it would have 29 to 31 infantry. As you can see, we've got 31 infantry exactly, so we're good on the infantry front, have a little bit too much cavalry and not enough artillery. Ideally, in this situation, we would want 27 artillery, and here's why. So artillery can't actually attack from the front row, which means the only place they can do damage is from the back row, and from the back row, they only do half of their advertised damage compared to infantry and cavalry. However, artillery generally don't take casualties unless they get pushed up to the front row. Moreover, artillery also protects units from incoming fire damage. It reduces that damage proportional to the amount of the fire modifier that you have on your artillery. That's a very important thing to understand. And that's why you should always strive, if you can afford it, to have as much artillery in the back row. In this case, because our combat width is 27. So, ideally, your artillery amount should equal the current combat width that you have. Ours is 27. We ideally would want 27. However, artillery is very, very expensive, and this can make it very difficult to do. So just bear in mind that the more artillery you can actually afford to field is good. However, sometimes 3 infantry regiments would be a better idea, depending on how your armies are already stacked, and considering whether or not you have better shock or fire modifiers at the time. Now, it's not really a big deal in the early game because fire modifiers aren't that high. However, when you start getting to Tech 16, when artillery gets its first big, fire modifier, if we look here. So, Tech 16, we get our first +1. That means that artillery is at 2.4, or, as we would know from having the damage, 1.2, which is basically, as far as I know, better than what infantry, or about equal to what infantry would have. So basically, by having artillery in the back row, you're protecting your own units and essentially doubling the amount of fire damage that you're doing simply by having that. Not including, of course, cavalry fire, which is not very good, but it is still there. Now, by Tech 22, we get our first +2 to artillery, and at this point, artillery is more effective than infantry at doing damage. And so if you're not properly stacked by Tech 22, and you are fighting an enemy that is properly stacked and has enough artillery to cover the entire back line, you are going to hurt in that fire phase. So you really need to have a proper stack by Tech 22, though Tech 16 is ideal. So anyway, let's just recap. So typically you want to have, depending on the Tech 0 to 17, you want 4 cavalry per stack. Tech 18 to 22, about 6 cavalry per stack. And Tech 23 to 30, about 8 cavalry per stack. You then subtract that from the combat width modifier, or the combat width. So in our case, we only need 4 cavalry, which means that would leave us with 23 infantry, and then we want to add 6 to 8 of that to have extras to replace the front line, which will put us at 29 to 31, which we have in this situation. So any casualties we take are going to be replaced fairly quickly and efficiently, and so we're going to lose less troops as a result of that, because depleted regiments do less damage. Lastly, you want to have as many artillery as you can afford that meets the exact combat width, because that is the exact amount of artillery that will fit, and as long as your artillery aren't taking casualties, which they shouldn't if you have an infantry and cavalry, then that's all you're ever going to need out of one stack. Now, building multiple stacks of that may be a little bit difficult. That being said, that's how you properly stack. And without further ado, let's show what proper stacking can do against an opponent that is not properly stacked. So here we're fighting an Ottoman army that has 0 artillery, We've mostly defeated him already, but let's take a look at like the amount of damage that we're doing here to the Ottoman. Yes, he's taking a brutal amount of damage. And as you can see in this battle, because first of all, because we outnumbered them so much, you know, they had 25,000 troops. We had our, let's see, what is this? This is like, you know, it's 53, about 61,000 troops. So we only took about 4,000 casualties and, you know, killed about 16,000 Ottomans. That's pretty good. And now to further prove the point, we're going to go attack this army in Cairo. He might win this siege, but that's okay. We've regained a bit of our morale. We're not at full morale while we're starting this battle, which is less than ideal. However, let's see, they've got 10 infantry, 2 cavalry, and 10 artillery. So the battle has begun. And let's take a look at how the actual unit deployment is going for us. So, as we can see here, only one of our cavalry has actually deployed because we have a little bit too much cavalry. However, note that we are still outflanking them, which means they are taking a little bit extra damage, and we have enough artillery to actually cover the line here. Let's see how this pans out against the Ottomans, who do have a decent number of troops, and so they're going to take less damage during the fire phase. But during the shock phase, because we have the flanking advantage because of our numerical superiority, we should see a pretty significant increase in damage. So let's slow down time. Let's see how each of these ticks goes. Losing about equal troops on this phase. And we started our first shock phase. We're killing them about 4-1, especially because the Ottomans rolled a 0. That's really hurting them. And because we're doing so much damage to them, note that because we're outflanking them, their cavalry are taking damage as well, which means that, you know, they're going to be much less effective at actually, you know, doing their job, especially if they get fully depleted, and then the flanking gets even worse from there. So this is why first of all, having a numerical advantage is important, as well as having a flanking advantage if you've actually got the tech for it. And now that we're back to our second fire phase, we can see that the Ottomans are taking significantly more damage. We are killing them 4-1 in this current phase. And back to the shock phase. And as you can see, because our units are better stacked, we are just simply butchering them. We've lost 2,500 infantry and killed just a massive amount of troops here in return. Now, one of the big problems with properly stacking an army is that you're going to take a lot of attrition while doing it. It's just a fact of life. However, I think that the benefits far outweigh the cons, especially if you have things like quantity ideas or defensive ideas to help deal with the manpower, or even aristocratic for that 25% better, you know, ability. Let's do one more battle to further demonstrate the point here. We're going to wait for like 2 months to pass, and then we're going to go attack the Ottomans here. Attack this 19 stack. Note that these units have significantly less artillery, and as a result, in the fire phase, we should be dominating our enemies because our army is much better stacked. Now this is going to be our toughest battle yet. The Ottomans have 32,000 troops. However, we outnumber them 2-1, and as a result of our better stacking, we should see a significant increase in the combat effectiveness of our troops. We are taking 3% attrition walking through this desert. Not really ideal, but we are going to catch up to the Ottomans here, I think. No running away. He's got a 5-fire general, but we've got a 4-shock general. So let's see how this affects things. The Tunisians are also going to join us. However, their modifiers are actually about the same as ours, minus that we have defensive ideas for higher morale. The Tunisians are going to arrive on March 6th, and so are we. The Ottomans have nowhere to go, and so we should see a pretty massive outflank here. Now, during the fire phase, we are going to take more damage because he has a 3-fire general better. So let's just slow down time and see how these phases go. As you can see, we are currently not outflanking them because they have enough people to fill the combat with. However, during the fire phase, the artillery is doing a massive amount of damage to the Ottomans. However, once it reaches the shock phase, we should see the casualties start to equalize a little bit. As you can see, we have a 5 to their 6. But because we depleted their regiments a little bit more during the fire phase due to our artillery, the cavalry of our cavalry is doing more damage than their infantry, and our infantry are doing more damage than their infantry because they're less depleted from that initial fire phase. As you can see, the Ottomans' damage are dropping with every single tick. simply because their troops are being depleted. And this is why you want to have extras and don't want to fight a numerically superior opponent. It's also important to note that I don't think, we don't have any combat modifiers apart from a 3% discipline and our better morale. But morale doesn't affect casualties. As you can see, we reached our next shock phase. We are taking some damage, but the amount of casualties that we're inflicting to the Ottomans is significantly higher. As you can see, we're killing about 700 more of them per phase, and most of these regiments that are in the front are completely depleted. And as a result, are taking, ridiculous amounts of damage. And as I said, with each phase, the Ottomans are getting weaker and weaker, and taking more casualties and inflicting less. As we can see here, we lost about 10,000 troops, but we managed to defeat about 16,500 specifically. So, as you can see, the benefits of proper stacking are quite powerful when you can achieve it. Having extra cavalry is debatable. It's certainly good in the early game if you can afford it. However, having infantry simply because they're cheaper might be a better idea. But anyway, I hope you found this video to be useful. I hope it explained how the combat with mechanic works, how to properly stack your armies, and I hope that it will serve you well on the battlefield. As for me, I'll have to see you guys in the next one.